What's up everyone, my name's MarkHawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with the AS200V and we're putting it up against the GoPro Hero4 Black edition running the latest 2.0 firmware. Now we're going to get out of the city for a few hours and we're going to head to Big Bear Mountain where we're going to test it in some snow and some much harsher conditions. So let's get out there. You can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in. There's a lot of features to cover, so sit back and we'll start playing them all. Now, if any of this footage looks familiar and you've watched one of our other comparisons, it's because we're filming with 4 cameras at the same time to get more done, so let's get to it. We're going to take a look at what each camera does best at 30 frames a second. Now with the Hero4 Black edition, we're actually going to be filming at 40K, that's our max resolution at 30 frames a second, with a max bit rate of 60 megabits a second, and our file size per minute is going to be about 432 megabytes. The Sony AS200 is going to be doing 1080p at 30 frames a second with a bit rate at 60 megabits a second, with around 368 megabytes per minute. With the AS200V, we're filming in the XAVC-S mode, and this is basically its pro mode, and it's how it enables us to have the higher bitrate of 60 megabits a second. But in order to enable this, we need to have the right micro SD card, and you're going to want to get an XC formatted card with a write speed over 60 megabits a second. There's a few suggestions in the more information section below. Now you'll notice the AS200V has a much cooler color tone with a very high contrast. The Hero4 Black, however, is much warmer, much softer, and I think a lot of the flatness and sort of washed out look you're seeing is mainly because we're filming on a 4:3 sensor that is then cropped to a 16:9 aspect ratio. This is just sort of my sort of thought process on it, and you'll notice that when we face away from the sun, a lot of that contrast will return. Now, if you look at the AS200V, take note of the sky in sort of the blue zones. That artifacting you're seeing, that's not from YouTube compression. That's something that's just happening naturally in the footage when we have these large areas that are a very similar color. Now you might look at the AS200V and be like, that's a much sharper image, there's a lot more in focus, but really it's that color grade that's giving it that extra sharpness. Since we're crunching the blacks a lot and popping those whites, it gives the appearance that that the AS200V is much sharper, but we're going to actually apply the same type of color grade to the Hero4 footage, and we're going to zoom into 200% here. Now, if you take a look in sort of the tree areas, it might be a little hard to distinguish with some of the compression that YouTube has, but it is a little softer. But where you'll notice a lot more detail is in those background mountains on the Hero4 Black. So we're going to have a lot more detail in sort of the trees and stuff like that, and this is beyond just because it's 4K. It's just the quality of the lens and the sensor in the Hero4 Black are kind of superior. As we turn away from the sun, we'll see some of that contrast return naturally into the Hero4 Black, but it still does appear a little more washed out, especially when it's compared to the AS200V. Now you'll notice with that we have a lot more saturation. Again, the blacks and the whites are crunched a little more, and it becomes a very appealing image. Now this image is somewhere in between, in reality, somewhere in between these two images. Those rocks in the background in reality aren't as white as they are on the Hero4 Black, but they're nowhere near as yellow on the AS200V. Now the Hero4 Black actually gives us a bunch of filming options, especially in resolution. So here we have the 1440p, which is my preferred way to film, because when I'm like on a mountain bike, I won't accidentally aim the camera too low or too high. Now with the AS200V, we only have the option to film in sort of 16:9 wide, unless we turn on steady shot, which we have here. Now what that does is it kind of crops everything to a more narrow field of view, cutting off the sides, and we get nice stable footage. But the problem with filming in steady shot, and that being the only way to enable it, is that it comes with its own set of issues. Sometimes it'll drift if the camera is locked in place because it's trying to detect motion and it's trying to keep that steady, and sometimes it does it wrong. The Hero4 Black has a super view mode though, which is super wide, and it's actually using that 4:3 aspect ratio that we saw before, squishing it down so it causes some extra distortion, but it's really good for tight spaces. Unfortunately, with a super wide field of view, and it's similar to Sony's default field of view, you're actually going to have a lot of distortion on the sides of the camera. And if you notice, as the cars come around the bend on the AS200V, you're going to notice a lot of distortion, but we'll go more into that in a little bit. Now the reason why we're showcasing cameras in the snow today is because it's one of the hardest environments to film in. You have this bright reflective material that your camera needs to sort of expose all the way down to, but it can't expose it so down that it sort of crunches everything in the background and makes everything sort of garbage. But if it does it in reverse, you're going to bloom out the snow and you're going to wash out everything in the picture. So as you can see, their Hero4 Black has that warmer tone, and again, it looks more washed out. But what we're going to do is, again, we're going to apply that color grade that's similar to the Sony, just to show some detail and show not so much a more fair in sharpness, but that was a comment I saw in a lot of videos, was that maybe the color grade on the AS200V was giving it an unfair sort of sharpness comparison. So we're just sort of crunching the blacks normally here, and if we had Pro Tunes enabled, if we had the flat color mode, we can have more range to play around with. And I'm not the best with color grades, but that was just sort of my attempt to sort of match that color grade so you guys can see the sharpness when we zoom in to 100% there. Now the AS200V is sporting its natural color grade, and we're going to go back to the Hero4 Black, which is going to have its default color grade, which again feels kind of washed out. And I do feel this is largely in part because we're facing into the sun and how the Hero4 handles that. It's got kind of a reddish green tint to it and stuff like that, but when we turn it about 9 degrees to the right and we're not looking at the sun, a lot of that contrast returns. Now the Hero4 Black, unfortunately though, is still kind of doing some, I don't want to say weird things with its color profile, but my jacket isn't that sort of cyan teal, it's more of that bluish teal on the AS200V. Now you can just sort of get an idea of these two images, like what's a more appealing image. But if we zoom in here, take a look at that tree above my left shoulder. There's going to be a lot of detail in the sort of branches and stuff like that, especially on the Hero4 Black. The AS200V, though, for being a $300 camera, is doing a pretty good job. But the one area that's still concerning to me with a lot of the AS200V footage, and even the X1000V footage, is how it's handling the sky. Again, you're going to see that artifacting pop back up. That's not stuff introduced through my compression. That's coming right out of the camera, right out of the raw renders. And when we blow it up to 100% here, you can see how much of the sky it sort of takes up and kind of makes gray and stuff like that. I honestly wouldn't know how to easily fix that, but I've never had that problem with the Hero4 Black. It handles those transitioning sort of colors that are very similar very easily. It doesn't sort of compress them. And that's one of the things you can notice on the AS200V is how it's kind of achieving some of its tricks with compression and stuff like that. So we're going to do a minor audio test here, so I'm going to quiet down, but just keep some of the things I said in mind as we sort of blow it up to 100% here.
Just might step back. Oh! We are good driving, I stay in my lane. Getting cold, it makes me insane.
So we're putting the cameras in a difficult spot again. We have the sun pointed right at the cameras, we have a bright reflective material right behind it, and we're going to kind of test and see how it handles things in the foreground here. Now if you notice the girl playing with her hair in the center of the screen, take a look at her pants, take a look at her lower back, and just notice the detail differences there. On the AS200V we're crunching down those blacks a lot, so we're losing a lot of that detail, but the Hero4 Black keeps everything a little bit lifted, and we have more wrinkle detail and stuff like that, we have more sharpness detail. The one area though that's completely the opposite, take a look at the sort of the mountain behind her. Up top you see a lot of the trails on the AS200V caused by snowboarders and skiers creating tracks. The Hero4 Black, you don't see that information right away with the default color grade. And we're going to switch here in a second to the flat color mode of each of these respective cameras, and this is so we can sort of adjust the colors in post-production with a lot more range. We'll have a lot more levels of black and a lot more levels of white to deal with. Now, the AS200V is going to wash out a lot of those trails when we enable flat mode. A lot of that information almost seems the opposite. I feel like we are losing white values for some reason when we're going into the flat color space, but if we start messing around with levels and stuff like that, a lot of this information comes back. And you can see in the Hero4 Black, a lot of that track detail is there. It's just, again, the way its color grade was being handled, it's losing a lot of that by default. Now, one area I didn't really have a good way to test or show off the test was the AS200V's sort of lens distortion. Now we kind of touched on this briefly when we were looking at Super View mode on the Hero4 Black. Notice how when I'm on the side of the screen here, how much I kind of bend and distort, my head gets kind of ovalish. This is one area of the AS200V that it's really good to know the limitation of. Basically when we rotate directly to the left or the right, or tilt up and down, similar to any movement you would have on a tripod, you're going to notice this extreme bending distortion as you turn the camera. And I thought this would be really disorienting when I was, going down the mountain, but when the objects were kind of far away and we were just kind of cruising, this never really affected me. So it's one of those limitations you should be aware of with the AS200V when filming. Speaking of limitations, this is one that a lot of us get affected by, and that's sort of handheld shakiness. Now, this ruins a lot of good shots. The AS200V has a built-in stabilizer, which uses its built-in accelerometer and then an algorithm to kind of stabilize your footage. Now, the one downside is you are restricted to only doing this in a sort of more medium field of view, so you can't do it in your full wide view, and with like examples with the X1000V, you couldn't do it in your 4K mode. But the Hero4 Black doesn't really have a stabilization equivalent. It doesn't have anything in GoPro Studio, but what's nice with the AS200V is all of this is being done in camera. We don't have to worry about doing this in post-production. Another downside is you will see some distortion in the corners of the screen as the camera sort of warps the footage to kind of keep it steady. And it's not going to remove all of your jitters and stuff like that. What it's doing is basically removing about 70% of it. And the big deal with the AS200V, the upgrade over the AS100V, is it's better handling sort of micro vibrations. Again, like we're gonna hit this bump, it doesn't completely get rid of the bump, but it removes about 70% of it. And as long as you work within those limitations, you know what it can and can't do, you're gonna notice you have this much nice smoother ride. And again, I mentioned earlier, the steady shot is the only way to change the field of view with the AS200V. There's no way to change it without, enabling steady shot, which is kind of a downside because, again, it can affect your footage in negative ways that you might not want. If you have a locked off shot with steady shot on, the footage has a tendency to sort of drag to the left or the right as it tries to detect if it's moving or not. And then again, we have those warpiness issues and stuff like that. So it's just limitations we can't avoid if we want to change the field of view. But when we are in these shaky environments and we work within those limitations, it works out great. I'm gonna hit this table here, nailed it. So yeah. So here we're taking a look at the sort of various slow motion options. Now, if you've watched some of our other videos, you'll know with the Sony AS200V, I had issues importing the slow motion into Premiere Pro, and that was mainly with 240 frames a second footage. However, when you bring it into Sony's ActionCam software, works perfectly fine. You can render it out, and I didn't have any issues with 120 frames per second on the AS200V. Now, the 200V can only do 120 frames a second at 720p, so it's kind of a big dip in quality compared to the Hero4 Black, which can do 120 frames a second at 1080p. Now, color grades aside, there's a much higher level of clarity and quality with the Hero4 Black at 120 frames per second, but the option is there in HD for the AS200V. Now, the next section we're going to go into is our audio test, and there's one thing I want to point out real quick is that we have steady shot turned on the AS200V. Look out for that warpingness as a camera that's on the left side of it comes in and out.
They told us we could only play for 30 minutes today. I know. I changed my guitar strings. I did all kinds of stuff, and they're saying, I think we just about hit 30 minutes right now. What should we do? I'm good with 30. No, I think we're gonna play a few more, man. Maybe life is like a ride on a freeway, dodging bullets while you're trying to find a way. Everyone's around me, no one does a damn thing. It brings me down, but I won't let that if I see it blink. Better you be correct, and if I don't speak, it's as a distance cut, but I won't be. Burn a bottle of affection on the fire in your eyes as you're staring at the sun.
Alright, the GoPros are both filming in Super View mode for the GoPro Hero4 Silver, that's 1080p. Super mode, 30 frames a second. For the Black, that's 2.7K Super, 30 frames, both in their GoPro color grade, and the Sonys are at their default, same as before, so 4K or 1080 in their color mode and their default lens width. One thing I've been able to take away from filming with these cameras for the past few weeks is that the Sony line of cameras does a really good job if the audio source is pointed directly at it. It has a really good dynamic range and a really good sound, especially for instruments. The Hero4 Black, however, does a really good job of capturing the environment around it. And if you're sort of at an event and stuff like that, it does a really good job of picking up a good range of everything around you. Now we're moving into sort of the low light part of our test here, the Hero4 Black starts to really shine here because of that warmer color grade. Now take a look at the text you see on the bench compared to the AS200V, much sharper, much more clarity and stuff like that. Branch detail as well, and how the sunlight's coming through those branches. We could just see a lot more leaves moving in there that aren't all smudgy and blown out. Now we're going to move back into LA for a few tests here. We actually came back to LA after watching a few other comparisons that came out before ours, and we just wanted to double check some of our settings to make sure all of our settings were at the default, if our old settings matched, our old results matched our new results, and they did. So the Hero4 Black here, again, we have this sort of low light condition, we have some really nice greens and stuff like that. If you look at that sort of bushy tree in the middle of the screen on the right hand side, you're going to see there's a lot more detail in those branches and stuff like that. But what we're going to do here is we're going to actually try and apply, again, that AS200V sort of color grade here, because you'll notice in the Hero4 Black, a lot of that stuff in the distance gets lost in sort of that sort of flat grade. We're losing a lot of the skyline, and I wanted to see if we could bring back any of that just by crunching the blacks a little bit. Now I know this is somewhat of a cheat, but I just want to show, you know, like, and again, the color grade is not perfect, obviously, but I just wanted to show some of that detail was there. If some of that sharpness that you're seeing in the AS200V is merely just attributed to having a different type of color grade that crunches those blacks and whites a little more. Taking off the color grades from here on out, so everything is just its default color grade. And with the X1000V, we're looking at this sunset here, but you'll notice there's a lot of distortion with that ledge on there. So if we wanted to correct that, we would actually have to lose a lot of this frame. With the Hero4 Black, we actually have the built-in preset into the GoPro Studio software, which is free, and we can remove a lot of this lens distortion fairly easily. And again, we're keeping all this detail. There's a bunch of detail in those clouds. It looks beautiful and stuff like that. The color grade, again, a little flatter, but, you know, I think we've proven that if we want to retain some of that, we could just crunch those levels, and that's actually really easy to do with the GoPro Hero4 Black software. Again, it's GoPro Studio 2.0, a lot of cool color tools and stuff like that. Now, both of these shots were not meant to be synced, so you're not supposed to see my face there, but we're looking at the railings and stuff here, looking at the chipped paint. We're just, again, seeing, as we go into that low light condition, what type of details sort of remain. I'm sure you've noticed by now, but we've gone back to filming at what's best at 30 frames per second. So we're going to keep doing this until we get to the nighttime tests, and yeah, just take a look at the range of blacks here. The AS200V is blowing out the upper left side of the screen a little much. If I wanted to sort of pull down that sky, there wouldn't be a lot of information there. A lot of that information is actually clipped. But with the Hero4 Black, if you look in that same area in the upper left, you'll see there's a lot more cloud details and stuff like that. If I brought the gamma down, we could actually see a lot more of those clouds. But if we take a look at these rocks in the center, or even the sort of water ripples, you could just see the sort of sharpness and crispness and just general amount of detail compared to the AS200V, which is actually a little smudgy. But again, it's the difference between a $500 camera and a $300 camera. Now you might look at the Hero4 Black and go, oh, well, that's a better quality for what I need, but is it $200 better? Are you going to get everything you want out of that camera? Are you going to use those features that the Hero4 Black offers for that extra $200, or are you better off going with a $200 option, a $300 option? You know, that's kind of the point of these videos, is to kind of show you options and just kind of help you make a purchasing decision, not, hey, let's look at this camera that does 1080p versus camera that does 4K. Each of these things costs money, and that's important to you guys, so I want to show you the range of what your dollar gets you. And again, these shots just look awesome. I love this setting, those black levels, the sun, so good. So we're moving into night here. We've actually switched the frame rate down to 24 frames a second, and the reason why we've done this is because it allows more light per shutter frame, and it's kind of the best results we've had for nighttime. So with the Hero4 Black, we actually have more control over some of the sort of internal workings, and we're actually able to adjust the ISO down to 1600. Now with the AS200V, we don't really have any of those controls, but it does low light really well because of its backlit illuminated sensor. So we're able to get a better low light picture with less grain. And that's the reason why we're turning the ISO down to 1600 on the GoPro. Because if we enable it up to 6400, what it's doing is it's artificially gaining up the camera, and that sort of cranks up all of that grain that's already there, and it's going to be much more apparent, and it's kind of unworkable. Like if I wanted to use that for a production, I'd have a hard time getting rid of that grain just for the sort of added light. I can work more with the sort of lesser quality, the darker footage, and brightening that up than I can reducing some of this grain. And again, you know, you'll see when we go back to 1600, we have really nice black levels. We do have a large amount of grain, and it really introduces a lot of that red that's natural in its color profile when we're bumping it up to 6400 ISO. And when we got to go back and do that second day of shooting, it allowed us to show both of these cameras in a different type of nighttime environment, and that's the city, where there's actually a lot more lights naturally in the area. Now that backlit image sensor on the AS200V is still helping us out a lot. You can take a look at that ledge on the left side of the screen and just notice how much brighter it is than the Hero4 Black, which again is introducing a lot of red to its blacks. But in terms of detail and quality, the Hero4 Black definitely still has a lot of it there. If you look at the arc light sign, there's just a little bit more crispness compared to the AS200V. But on both cameras, you know, we're losing detail in things like the McDonald's sign. Now, if you wanted to use both of these cameras as sort of a security camera or a dash camera for your ride home, just to sort of protect yourself for insurance reasons, you're probably going to want to change the frame rate from 24 frames a second to 30 frames a second, and that's to avoid motion blur. Again, when we're doing like things like steady shot, we want to avoid motion blur. That way we get more information. You don't want that license plate to get captured and be all motion blurred. So we'll up the ISO to 6400 here just to show you how bright it gets, and when we put these guys side by side, you're going to really notice that sort of red tint in the Hero4 Black come up. But you know, the AS200V is still introducing a bit of blue to its shots and stuff like that. So it's kind of, again, that color grade preference on which you like more, but both do a really good job. So one area that both of these cameras handle very differently is how it handles time-lapse. Now I'll start with the Hero4 Black. It's using the full range of its image sensor, its 12 megapixel image sensor, to give us the same raw quality photos we'll get from stills. The AS200V, however, is giving us basically these 1920 by 1080 stills that are much lower in quality. They look great on like a television screen like this, but if you're a photographer and stuff like that, it's going to be missing a lot of that quality and sort of depth that you would have in your colors. To really sort of manipulate and edit. The Hero4 Black is giving you the full range of a still photo. Now the AS200V might be doing this to work with, I think it's called Motion Shot LE or something like that. Someone in the comments brought it up to me yesterday. But basically it allows the camera to build the time lapse in the camera for you, so you don't have to do any work in post. And the AS200V also does this thing where it names the still photos the same as the time-lapse photos, so you kind of really have to know where your time-lapse photo ended and where you started taking your real photos. We didn't really run into it with this time-lapse, but the Hero4 Black actually allows us to control a lot of things, such as the white balance and lock that off, the ISO, the exposure, and the shutter speed during these time-lapses. So if we wanted to do a time-lapse overnight and get more exposure into the stars, we could do that. The AS200V doesn't give us a lot of these controls. We can mess with the white balance and exposure a little bit, but I don't know if I can lock it in, or yeah, I guess we could lock it because we can take it off of auto white balance. But it's also good to note that, like, when we were doing this time-lapse, we never ran into an issue where the white balance was changing rapidly and over a long period of time, which was sort of flickering out of one color space and into the other. With the Hero4 Black, again, we have more options with our photos, but before we get into that, the AS200V takes really great still photography, which is really a shame that we don't have that same level of quality in the time-lapse, and that's kind of why I'm upset with it a little, because if we look at these two images, besides color and stuff like that and aspect ratio, I'd be very nitpicky to say which camera is better than the other. They're both taking great photos. The only big difference is with the AS200V, we have a giant 16:9 image, which again shows more left and right, and the and the Hero4 Black does sort of 4:3, which shows more top field of view and bottom field of view. Now again, we mentioned having control of that shutter speed, and what we're doing here is we're lowering the shutter speed from 2 seconds to 5 seconds to 10 seconds, and what that allows us to do at nighttime is take these much brighter images without introducing artificial gray, and we're actually allowing light to enter the camera for a longer period of time and take these sort of pitch dark environments and just sort of brighten them up. And this could lead to a lot of cool sort of photography tricks, or again, a lot of really nice nighttime shots, especially if you're doing time lapse. And that's not to say the AS200V doesn't have really good results in low light. In fact, we're doing a lot of this without adjusting any settings. It's really good at doing these auto low light photos and even normal day photos. We actually don't need to touch the AS200V a lot of times to get the results we want. It's just I don't have the control if I want it. But again, it also keeps it very simple. So it's kind of this sort of tug of war on if you want to keep it simple or do you want to have control. Anyway, everyone, that wraps up our side-by-side between these two cameras, but before you guys go anywhere, please press that like and share button if you found this video useful. It will help me pop up in the search results and stuff like that, and if you guys want to go the extra mile, check out our newly launched Patreon page over at patreon.com/MarkHawkCam. Now, if you don't want to leave YouTube, you can actually go to our main page, and we actually have a little Google Wallet now that you can fund us through, and this just helps me buy more cameras because videos like this cost me thousands of dollars out of pocket. Anyway, there's still a lot more to check out between these two cameras, so make sure you subscribe or check out any of these links. And I'm MarkHawkCam, and I'll see you out there.